Is the Rockefeller standing in plain sight the main villain of the planet? Is this really the case? Let's figure it out. A few years ago, it became known about the creation of a single international trust between the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. Many analysts were puzzled by this fact. After all, the entire 20th century was marked by the struggle of these two families. The official version is as follows. Two clans unite to survive the waves of the global economic crisis. But what really happened? The first oddity of the new alliance is that the superfamilies have combined amounts of only $40 billion. Such sums may seem decent to Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, but not to the world's leading financial clans. Today, the total wealth of the Rothschilds, according to rough estimates, exceeds $4 trillion. The Rockefellers' total capital is calculated in the same order, only $1 trillion less. It turns out that the pooling of capital is not a bid for survival, but an obvious claim to dominance in the post-crisis world, the tip of the iceberg in the struggle of some closed elites with others. But if the Rothschild and Rockefeller alliance is going to fight with someone, then they are not the first figures in the world of global financial backstage. Meyer Rothschild, the founder of the dynasty, was born in Germany in 1744, and the American John Rockefeller Sr. almost 100 years later. By the way, we will make a video about the Rothschild clan in the near future, so set up notifications so that you don't miss it. So, if these are relatively young families in historical perspective, then who ruled the planet when the Rothschilds Rockefellers walked under the table on foot? Maybe a family whose members founded their Standard Chartered Bank back in 1613? The real power is the secret power, and as you know, big money loves silence, and therefore the Baruchs always try to stay in the shadows. Unless, when life demanded it, Bernard Baruch broke the rule by becoming an economic advisor to as many as 7 U.S. presidents. Here is his brief history. In 1881, the Baruch family moved to New York, and the young man Bernard entered City College, after graduating from which he worked as a broker on the New York Stock Exchange, and in 1903 established his own brokerage company. Contrary to the fashion of the time for associations and trust companies, Bernard Baruch conducts his rather successful brokerage business allegedly alone, although of course the support of the oldest clan ensures takeoff. But for the public, Bernard gets the nickname the Lone Wolf of Wall Street, and by the age of 33 becomes a millionaire, while managing to increase his capital in conditions of the ongoing crises in the United States. Since 1912, Baruch has been playing the political card by financing Woodrow Wilson's election campaign. In gratitude for his support, Wilson introduces him to the Department of National Defense. During the First World War, Baruch became the head of the U.S. Military-Industrial Committee and unwound the flywheel of arms buildup, which allows for some time to overcome a series of crises in the country's economy. It was Baruch, as an advisor to the president, who persuaded Wilson to support the idea of creating the Fed, and since 1913, the U.S. government has delegated the authority to produce dollar bills to a commercial structure, the Federal Reserve System. After the revolution in Russia, Baruch unexpectedly became a supporter of cooperation with the Soviet Union. Together with Hammer and Harriman, Lenin invites him to restore the national economy of the Soviet country. One of the first factories built by Americans in Russia in the 1920s and 1930s were tractor plants in Volgograd, Kharkov, and Chelyabinsk. Of course, these factories had a dual purpose. In addition to tractors, they began to produce tanks, armored vehicles, and other weapons. The cars necessary for the army were produced at 2 main factories, Gorky and Im. Likachev, which was built with a subsidy from Henry Ford in the 1930s. American companies have also built 2 huge steel-making plants in Magnitogorsk and Kuznetsk. Anticipating the development of the situation in the world, Baruch, with American and British bankers in solidarity with him, carried out a creative maneuver in the late 20s. He is seeking to reorient American economy towards servicing the military-industrial complex through its artificial collapse and plunging into a state of crisis. He demonstrates his actions to the rather promising British politician Winston Churchill, whom he invites to America under the pretext of giving lectures. On October 24, 1929, the day of the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange, Baruch brings Churchill to Wall Street. At a time when an excited crowd was raging outside the New York Stock Exchange, he shares with Churchill information that a year before the collapse, he stopped playing on the stock market, sold all his shares and bought U.S. government bonds instead, ensuring that his capital was preserved from depreciation. Churchill was greatly impressed by this, and since then their friendship with Baruch has acquired not only a personal character, but also the features of a strategic partnership. It was Baruch and Churchill who became active organizers of the game to strengthen and then clash the foreheads of Germany and the USSR. In the same year, 1933, the United States fully establishes diplomatic relations with the USSR, and Bernard Baruch and prominent American politicians are meeting Soviet envoys in America, Maxim Litvinov and Yevgeny Rozengoltz, to work out a joint line of conduct. It should not be forgotten that after the revolution, Litvinov was the Bolshevik envoy in London, and in December 1917 wrote a very interesting letter of recommendation to the British diplomat and intelligence officer Lockhart about Trotsky. I consider his stay in Russia useful from the point of view of our interests. By the way, about Litvinov, in 1939, in the minds of many today's patriots who want immediate happiness for everyone at once, Joseph Vissarionovich was completely sovereign in the country. And then, that's the bad luck. The direct betrayal of the then People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Litvinov, was revealed. Better known in certain circles as Mir Genok Moisevich Wallach. What authoritative and competent authorities did with traitors to the motherland in those days is well known. They were punished, sometimes very severely and suddenly. And what could the all-powerful do Stalin, who, according to the memoirs of contemporaries, spoke at a government meeting about the betrayal of Litvinov Wallach, with difficulty keeping calm? It's nothing serious. Ask Litvinov to write a statement of his own free will, and put him under house arrest in a comfortable Litvinov dacha, and everything. And the traitor died no less comfortably in 1951 at the venerable age of 75. It turns out that even Stalin could not dictate terms to these people. But let's return to Baruch, whose interests were not limited to the European theater. In 1934, he collaborated with the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, conducted an unprecedented operation to exchange Chinese gold reserves for a bundle of paper in the form of bonds. Cornered Chiang Kai-shek, suffering one defeat after another, agreed to this exchange, as a result of which businessmen from the United States received at least 100 tons of gold bullion and a huge amount of silver, jewelry, and antiques, and Chiang Kai-shek 250 sheets of paper and a quiet old age on the island of Taiwan. By the early 40s, Baruch was already a billionaire, but the peak of dividends from his business involved in politics came during the years of World War II and the post-war nuclear arms race. The Japanese attack on the American naval base Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, may have been a surprise to some, but not to Baruch and the banking oligarchy. At the cost of this provocation, America was dragged into World War II, and the oligarchs, and first of all Baruch, hit a huge jackpot. During World War II, Baruch continued to advise the government and exerted a strong influence on the distribution of state military orders. Billions of dollars were used to finance the areas he proposed. In 1944, thanks to the skillful play of Baruch and his partners at Bretton Woods, war-torn Europe and the USSR agreed to recognize the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. After World War IE, Baruch took over the US nuclear program and took over the nuclear industry. Baruch wants to rule the world, the moon, and possibly Jupiter, but we'll see about that, President Truman wrote in his diary. This phrase clearly demonstrates who actually made significant decisions, and the president could only envy, but could not openly oppose. With the beginning of the arms race, which brought fabulous profits to the contractors of the American military-industrial complex, Baruch personally controlled the production of the American atomic bomb under the motto, "We must go forward with an atomic bomb in one hand and a cross in the other." After demonstrating the power of the United States by the atomic bombing of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, the Soviet Union took all measures to restore nuclear parity. In the current situation, the United States hastened, on the one hand, to convince the world community of its peace-loving aspirations, and on the other, carried out an ingenious combination in order to subordinate the development of nuclear energy worldwide to America. Of course, the initiator of such a large-scale plan was none other than Baruch, whom President Harry Truman appoints as the U.S. representative to the UN Atomic Energy Commission Energy. At its very first meeting on June 14, 1946, the American delegation announced a plan for the total prohibition of nuclear weapons, which went down in history as the Baruch Plan. Outwardly, the plan seemed to have good goals, but it assumed that the UN Atomic Energy Commission would conduct international inspections while granting it the authority to take compulsory measures against violators. Moreover, its decisions would not be subject to the veto of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. And here, Baruch's plans collided with the distrust of Stalin, who understood that their implementation would slow down the movement of the USSR to create its own nuclear potential, necessary to ensure its own security. The Soviet delegation at the UN conference took advantage of the fact that the American proposals fundamentally diverged from the UN Charter and its structure, and vetoed it. How did it end for Baruch? But nothing. Since 1949, a nuclear arms race began in the world, accompanied by the development of tactics and strategies of ideological sabotage, where Bernard Baruch felt like a fish in water. Until a very old age, he personally handled business. By the end of his life, the assets of the firms and funds under his control reached $1 trillion. Surprisingly, the arbiter of fate did not hide from people. He was very easy to communicate, talked in the park with vacationers, found out what their moods and wishes were, and there was no security near him. Baruch was laid to rest in 1965 in a simple cemetery on the outskirts of New York. There are no fences or pompous monuments on his grave, just a modest small stove on the lawn. Surprisingly, today nothing is known at all about the heirs of Bernard Baruch's trillion-dollar fortune, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Someone has deleted all the information with an almighty hand. There are also no collective photos from the funeral of Bernard Baruch, since they were probably attended by his legal successors who did not want to be seen. It is unknown who now manages the colossal assets of the owner of a trillion-dollar fortune. So, the Baruch Bank, created 400 years ago, is now modestly sheltered in the fourth 10 in the world rankings. Because there is a bank of banks that does not need any ratings, and there are all the others. And it is not by chance that, in the world production of 9/11, the international department of the headquarters of Standard Chartered Bank was located in an additional, allegedly, spontaneously collapsed building. In a matter of seconds, trillions of dollars worth of wiring disappeared in the ruins, and dozens of tons of gold were written off. But there are also the families of Schiff, Lieb, and Kuhn. Do you know anything about these surnames? Maybe it's worth making a video where they will no longer be the directors of entire countries and peoples, but where these owners of money will become the main characters, actors who reveal your inhuman essence. Put your thumbs up if you're intrigued, and set up notifications so you don't miss the premiere. See you soon.